Okay, John 9 and the story of the man born blind. Another one of these signs, a miracle that Jesus does that has all sorts of significance, special significance for the author of this gospel. Reminds me a little bit of some other stories in the Gospels, especially the business about Jesus anointing the eyes of the man born blind. And there's a similar story in Mark, the blind Bartimaeus, that may have served as the inspiration for this one. That's a great story, isn't it, with the guy comes to sight just gradually, right?
It's a great story.
And he sees, I think there are trees out there, and cows or something.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
And then eventually he finally gets his full sight back. And I sometimes wonder if something like that, the gradual process of coming to physical sight, might have been the inspiration for John's story, which is a gradual process of coming to some sort of spiritual sight. And we have the same sort of crescendo that
Absolutely,
we've
that
seen
we
in some
saw
other,
with some of the other stories,
where there's something, a deeper level of insight.
Yeah.
But there's also the opposition.
Yeah, both those things.
Yeah.
Oh, I think those are two main themes. And let me say a couple of my thoughts on that, and then a quick word on the way time comes together. On the growing insight, I think that, as is so often the case in John, the physical blindness, while undoubtedly taken literally, is also a kind of metaphor or symbol of spiritual blindness. And the miracle happens as this man moves from seeing nothing to seeing more and more and more. And it begins with his acknowledging that the change in his own life. Remember the song Amazing Grace? I once was blind, but now I see. Once was lost, but now I'm found, was blind, but now I see. Straight from John 9. The idea that the way in which one comes by faith is first acknowledging the difference in one's own life. And then secondly, the beginning to acknowledge that this has something to do with the man Jesus. It wasn't just me. And then finally, and I think this goes very much back to the way you've talked all the way along about the interesting connection between one's faith and being drawn. We act and we are acted upon throughout this whole gospel. That the final moment of faith, of belief, comes only when Jesus actually seeks him out. That he can't make himself believe unless the gift is given him of the presence of the living Lord. And that's to read it in a kind of a post-resurrection theme, but I think not unfairly in terms of the way it works in the life of the church. And the opposition is just the kind of picture of disbelief we get all the way along. They can't believe that anybody can be changed. The first doubt is, you can't possibly be the man who used to sit there. I know who that was. That guy couldn't see squat, and here you are seeing everything. And I think from that day until this, that's a major sign of disbelief. That is, we don't think anything's ever new, and so we have no hope. The second disbelief is that anybody can break the rules and still be from God. This whole dispute about a Sabbath, where you have a sense that somehow Jesus has now broken the rules and therefore he's got to be a sinner. And the man's belief, I don't care if he's a sinner. I was blind, now I see. And then the final opposition to them, that they think that the man should be just cast out, that they should throw him out of their community. And at that point is the place where one reason I hope we'd talk about this one a little bit was that I was persuaded a long time ago by Lou Martin, who we've talked about before, who taught at Union Seminary in New York for a long time and now lives here in Bethany, that this is one of those places where two times come together. The time of Jesus and the man born blind reflects on the time of John's own community, or a community very close to John's own community, where people are trying to decide whether to believe in Jesus or not. And if they do believe in Jesus, the danger they face is they're going to be cast out of the synagogue, which is what the man's parents fear in this story, and what happens to him. And that it's a kind of promise, I think, that if one has faith, despite the opposition, at the end of one's story, there is that kind of progress where one not only sees Jesus, but is seen by Jesus, that one enters into a kind of full, rich community.
Yeah, going back for a moment to the casting out of the synagogue, it's probably worth reflecting on that just a little bit, and Lou Martin's hypothesis about the embedding of the history of the community and the story of Jesus. And there's a lot to that.
Yeah.
And here the essential point is that being cast out of the synagogue is anachronistic for
Right,
first
absolutely.
First century
Right.
Galilee.
Right.
It would fit late first century Asia Minor or something.
Exactly.
Or later Galilee,
Yeah.
where the synagogue was an institution.
Yeah.
There's been a lot of speculation on what it was and whether this was a kind of universal persecution of Christians.
Right.
And Lou and others have toyed with the idea that you can pin things down to the last decade of the first century. It used to be the case that historians of Judaism thought that there was a special event that happened at a council of rabbis
Right.
at a place called Yavne
Yeah,
or
Yamnia,
Yamnia, at which a prayer was introduced into the synagogue liturgy that would have been very difficult for a believer in Jesus to say. Right now, a lot of historians are a little skeptical
Yeah.
of that reconstruction, and it's more likely that there were attempts to rid communities of Messianists, of Christians, in different places. Ad hoc,
Yeah.
So that there was a universal persecution by Jews of Christians is unlikely.
Yeah.
That there were tensions in Jewish synagogues
Absolutely.
all over the Mediterranean over this new Christ faith during the first century, that's highly likely.
Yeah.
And some of that is being reflected in the story of the man who's
Absolutely.
being cast out of the
Absolutely.
synagogue. So there's a bit of an anachronism there, which leads to this,
Yeah.
this reading, and I think
Yeah.
that's probably right. The other thing you're pointing to is a kind of nice literary feature of this text. The Greeks used to call it a chiasm, an X-like structure. So on the one side, you start with physical blindness that leads
Absolutely.
to both physical and spiritual openness and sight.
Slowly, yeah.
And on the other side, you start with what seems to be physical sight,
Yeah.
but spiritual blindness,
Blindness, yeah.
and the kind of arrogance and self-assuredness that you've attributed to
Yeah.
the opposition here, I think is embedded in
I
the
do
text.
too.
I think
I do
that's
too.
there. And they move eventually to a position of total blindness.
Exactly,
Right.
exactly.
And are condemned as such
Yeah.
through words of Scripture. So it's a very neat
No, it's
sort
neat.
of
It's a
package.
neat reversal.
And you can understand how this is a kind of reaction to the tensions
Yeah.
that some early Christians probably felt from their cousins, brothers, sisters,
Exactly,
or
exactly,
whatever
yeah.
in the synagogue.
Might be a good time to talk for just a minute about the way in which Jews are portrayed in John's Gospel, because I think that's problematic for our readers today. And I'm very much with you in the sense that what you have here is a kind of a record of a family feud. And the Jews and the Pharisees represent the cousins who stayed in the synagogue, and the good guys are those who split off. And as in so many family feuds, I know from my time in the pastorate, the worst arguments are between people who have been very close. The divorce or the fight over the will. You can be fairly cordial to your distant enemies. You're just miserable to the ones who are close at hand. And I think one of the dangers has been in Christian preaching, especially, that contemporary Christians have taken this as some kind of accurate description of late first century Judaism, and even worse, as if somehow Temple Bethel was full of hypocritical, nitpicking, legalistic Pharisees who don't understand the richness of grace. And that's not a fair reading either of first century Judaism or of Judaism today.
Mm-hmm. No, that's right. This is certainly not the worst of the passages in
No,
John.
by no means, but I think we're going to touch those
That's right.
cleverly.
Yeah, we ought to remember them,
Yes,
though.
absolutely.
And the main passage that causes offense is in the previous chapter, in chapter 8, where Jesus is involved in a pretty heated controversy with those who reject him. And he's laying claim to be the true son of Abraham, and they're saying he is no son of Abraham. He's really,
Exactly.
in
Son of
effect,
devil.
the son of a devil,
Yeah,
the son
yeah.
of a whore or something.
Yeah,
That's
so right,
implicit,
exactly,
in the background of
Yeah,
that,
in the background is probably
controversy.
that illegitimacy thing.
Yeah, and Jesus finally winds up calling his interlocutors there children of the devil,
Yeah,
the murderer from all eternity.
Yeah.
Pretty
Miserable.
awful
Yeah,
stuff,
awful
and
stuff.
has been misused in Western history in all sorts of ways.
Exactly.
I think we've come to recognize how deleterious that material is in the last 40 or 50 years since the Holocaust, and since we've become more aware of the way in which Christian preaching used to use this material. This is one of the places where I think it's very important to contextualize our reading of the gospel and understand it, as you say, as a kind of family feud in the first century, with some pretty important issues at stake.
Huge issues, huge issues,
but ones that can't be replicated in any
Exactly.
simple way in our environment.
Exactly. Just a couple other things I like about this story. As with the woman at the well, it's very neatly structured as a kind of drama. And in fact, when I use this in churches, you can divvy everybody up, and you have the parents, and you have the man born blind, and you have the Pharisees, and you have the disciples, and you have Jesus. And it's nicely plotted. It's one of those moments where if we're going to go with our friend and think that there's drama in chapter 13, maybe there's drama here too, that this is somebody who knows how you structure that. And then themes that we've had already. Here's the whole light thing from the prologue. So if we go back to our initial question, does the prologue lead into anything, or is it just kind of a nice set piece at the beginning? Here it clearly leads into a whole theme. And you have this judgment business, which is not simply something we anticipate, but has to do with the life we live now. And so to call ourselves seeing when we're blind is itself judgment.
Right. And on the light theme, of course, this is part of the larger context of the Feast of Tabernacles.
Absolutely.
That starts back there in chapter 7. And Jesus declares himself in chapter 8, I am the light of the world.
Yeah.
Picking up on the motif of light at the Feast
Yeah.
of Tabernacles. We tend to associate that, by the way, I think in this day and age with Hanukkah.
We do, yeah.
But Hanukkah was modeled on the Feast of Tabernacles when it was first developed in the 2nd century B.C. So that motif is here as a kind of dominant Jewish liturgical motif.
Yeah.
And Jesus is constantly interacting with that. So yeah, Jesus, the light of the world, comes into the darkness here and illumines it in a very dramatic way on various levels. The story is so neatly structured. Another element in here that picks up on earlier motifs and looks ahead is this title of the Son of Man.
Yes, yeah.
Which John plays with in so many interesting ways. And it's probably useful to remember, as we suggested in one of our earlier conversations, that in a lot of early Christian discourse, the Son of Man was associated with Jesus coming as judge.
Very much so, right, exactly.
And so this exemplifies the Johannine reinterpretation of that judgment motif. Here's the Son of Man, addressing himself as such, declaring himself to be such, being recognized as such finally by the man born blind, and judgment takes
and here
place
is judgment
in that
right
recognition,
now.
not in some final eschatological event.
Absolutely. Also, just the little ironies in the story I like, when the man born blind says to the people who are criticizing him, do you want to be his disciple too? I mean, it just, clearly, it's one of those rare places where John's having a little fun with his story and not just disagreeing with him, putting him down in a kind of sarcastic way.
Reminds me of the part of the woman of the well where do we want to be his disciple?
Yeah, exactly.
Same sort of thing.
Same sort of thing. So there's a little
nice
tongue-in-cheek in there in the midst of all this.
Nice little irony.
There's a nice little irony.
John knows how to use irony in various ways. Sometimes it's pretty heavy-handed. Sometimes.
Big and little.
And another way in which I think about this text is, in terms of its application and appropriation, the theme of blindness is something that I think we can all think about as an element of our own lives. And this is where the Johannine invitation into a dialogue with the text comes to the fore. Because on the one side, if you think about it just in those social terms and who's now outside of the community of believers, you forget that there's a continuous challenge. We talked a little bit ago about that continuity of challenge within the community of belief. And so I think John is a gospel as a whole, especially if you think about its relationship with earlier Christian tradition, is in effect a challenge to those who think they see.
Absolutely.
To examine their sight.
Exactly.
And see if they really understand who this Jesus hanging on the cross is.
See, I told you if you stayed at the divinity school long enough, you'd become a preacher. And you have.